Welcome to Thinking Deeply About Primary Education, the podcast that makes time and space to really think about pedagogy, teaching and learning, professional development, anything of interest to time-poor but enthusiasm-rich teachers. This week, I'm joined by Christopher Such,
Hello again.
and together we'll try and answer the question, how do you solve a problem like reading comprehension? But first, Chris, what you reading for?
This week I've been reading a book called Hands On, Minds On by Claire Cameron. It's a really interesting book about early development of executive function, spatial awareness, and motor skills in young children. The reason I've been looking into this is that a lot of the time recently when I've been talking about mathematics and I've been talking about mastery and other subjects, one of the areas that I keep coming back to are the aspects of learning, sometimes known as the prime areas when we're talking about EYFS stuff, that seem to underpin all of the learning that comes later. I'd highly recommend this book to anyone interested in the subject or anyone that just wants to have a shared language for talking about these underlying skills that goes a bit beyond the prime areas of the early learning goals. But yeah, it's a fantastic book. Highly recommend it. And you, Kieran, what you reading for?
So I've got a paper, haven't quite finished it yet, but I think it's one that people will find interesting. It's by Gert Biesta. I think it's called Why What Works Might Not Work, or something along those lines, and it looks at sort of the ontology and the epistemology of the working out what works, sort of approach to sort of teaching and learning, really. And I think the reason I started reading it is because, I always say we should seek out sort of things that we don't necessarily agree with, just to see what the nuance in the argument is. And I'll put the actual title in the show notes, but the title is something that sort of makes me think, I don't agree with this at all. This is really challenging my view of what education is. But to be fair, I think I'm 6 of 13 pages in, and there is a whole lot more nuance. And I think it's almost more about being cautious about our expectations. And some of the examples, are very, very polar extremes, and, the fact that the randomized control test could somehow magically be used to give us definite answers in education. And no one actually talks like that, but it's been an interesting read so far. And I think it might be one that listeners enjoy sort of diving into, even if it is just a challenge, sort of conceptions that have developed over the last, 10 or so years.
Yeah, sounds great. I mean, along those lines, I recently listened to Christian Bockhove. I hope I pronounced that right. His interview on the Mr. Barton Maths podcast. And yeah, he's fantastic at challenging some of these embedded ideas that I would be the first to admit that I, think have a great deal of value. But yeah, you have to seek out these people. Otherwise, particularly when they're as thoughtful and as nuanced as Christian Bockhove is, because otherwise, how are you going to really know what you know? How are you going to have any confidence in the things that you think? So I would highly recommend that as well. No, it's not a book, but chucking that out there as well.
Nice. So then I think we're ready to get down to the nitty-gritty of this episode. And I suppose listeners won't be surprised that I'm probably going to take a lot more of a back seat, because with the theme being reading comprehension and you being somewhat of an expert in this field and me not having taught reading in 5-6 years, I'll hold my hands up and say that my only experience of teaching reading is the 2 years that I spent learning to read in another language, over the last 24 months. So yeah, I'll be throwing the questions your way, Chris, and I'll try and throw, some opinions. But I think it's probably worth the disclaimer that it's entirely opinion based on my end. And I think the first thing we got to do, as always, is define reading comprehension. So what is reading comprehension, Chris?
Before I do that, I'm just going to quickly make it clear to those that this isn't a video episode. There's no video involved. It's just a podcast. I Kira will notice that I physically flinched at the word expert there. There's no word that seems to put people off listening to someone's opinions in education than hearing someone else say that they're an expert, or be told that they're an expert. So no, I'm not accepting that description. That aside, let's move on. So what is reading comprehension? Well, the first thing to say is it's the ultimate goal of all reading. So it goes without saying that when we teach children phonics and when we're looking to develop fluency and all of that other stuff that is required to develop reading comprehension, that the goal at the end of it all is this idea of reading comprehension. It's a really tricky thing to define, frankly. There are lots of different definitions out there. My favorite, that is kind of a hodgepodge of lots of different ones really, is that I would describe it as the process of extracting meaning from written language through the integration of knowledge related to words, texts, and the wider world. But in short, it really is, look at text, do I know what's going on? In order to kind of unpack that a little bit, it's worth talking briefly about different models for reading. Well, one specific model for reading that has been particularly pertinent over the last few, well, since 1986, actually, since Goff and Tunmer's paper on the simple view of reading. And that is the paper, The Simple View of Reading, and the model of reading that has that name. Effectively, it breaks reading into two components, or it breaks reading comprehension, I should say, or what is required for reading comprehension into two components. One of which is decoding, which we're not going to talk about a huge amount today, though from this point on, I hope it goes without saying that the ability to decode fluently is an essential aspect of reading comprehension. But it also looks at another aspect of that, which is listening or language comprehension. Now, the best way to describe this is to use an example. John Milton, the poet, famously lost his sight as later into adulthood, but still wanted to continue his studies. And one of the things that he was able to do was he asked his daughters to read Greek to him. They read Greek texts to him. Now, the interesting thing was that his daughters were able to decode Greek. They knew what the symbols represented in terms of sounds, but they weren't able to they had no clue what the actual words meant. Whereas on the other side of the equation, you had John Milton, who, while he was blind and thus completely unable to decode, because this is before the days of Braille, was able to do the other half. So the two aspects that go together to make reading comprehension, in this case, are held by the two different people. One of his daughters, who is doing the decoding half, and him, as he hears the words, doing the language comprehension half. So you end up with a person altogether as such who is able to comprehend what they read, but only because those two components there are interacting. Now, this is an extreme case where two different people are doing two different jobs, but it kind of shows us what is meant by the simple view of reading and by the separation of these two ideas, this language comprehension and this other half, decoding. It's also worth very briefly mentioning that this language comprehension isn't really, it's actually a tiny bit more complicated than that, in that the way I've described it makes it sound just like listening comprehension, the kind of comprehension that you can do, I hope, while hearing me speak. But it's actually a little bit more than that, because there are things like the structures of that are in a given text. So, for example, subheadings might be something that goes a bit beyond listening comprehension, but isn't really decoding either. And yet it can contribute to meaning. So language comprehension, this other half that goes along with decoding, actually goes a little bit beyond the analogy with John Milton that I just described, but I still hope it's useful. In summary, reading comprehension can be thought of as the product of language comprehension and of decoding. It is the process through that of extracting meaning from written language through the integration of knowledge related to words, texts, and the wider world. At least that's my definition.
Am I right in thinking the margins are pretty small too, Chris, when it comes to that process happening? like I say, think about my experience. All I need to do is not know 2 or 3 words, and I can get a whole different sense from a paragraph than if I know them all. What's going on there.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, and it's something we're going to be talking about a little bit later, is because of the way that vocabulary and background knowledge and all of the other aspects that lead to reading comprehension, because of the ways that they interact, a very small weakness in what you're understanding can make the whole thing fall apart. Let's say we were talking about a football match, and we said the final whistle went, and both groups of players fell to their knees, one in joy and one in despair. If you didn't know the phrase final whistle and didn't know that related to a sporting contest, that whole thing falls apart, even though you understand the syntax and the vocabulary and most of the background knowledge related to the rest of it. So there aren't great margins for error, particularly in a relatively short bit of text. When you get something a lot longer, it can be the case that we can begin to derive meaning, even if maybe we don't know 5 or 10% of the words. There are rough estimates, and it depends on the type of text. It's easier generally to work out the gist of a story than it is, for example, an information text. But it's worth noting that it isn't necessarily even then on or off. In fact, quite the opposite. A person can have taken some meaning from a text, while someone else can have taken a very precise meaning, and someone else can have taken exactly what the author intended. It's more of a spectrum necessarily than an on or off thing, though sometimes people will have completely missed the point of a bit of text.
Yeah, I reckon what you're reading for, there are definitely paragraphs in there that I had to read several times to really get the gist of. Yeah, and as you're saying, I'm thinking, yeah, it's a gut feeling. Yeah, I pretty much got this. I can move on to the next bit. Both when I'm reading academically and when I'm reading in Spanish, it's sort of like, yeah, I'm pretty sure. It's a continuum of of internal satisfaction.
And I love what you've mentioned there about the idea of you having to reread. I mean, part of being a fluent reader and part of having certain comprehension strategies that we'll talk about later embedded is the fact that you are obviously setting for yourself a particular standard of coherence. You're reading that text and you're going, it needs to make this much sense to me, or I go back and read again. Or I, maybe go online and check out the definition of particular words. You're setting a particular standard of coherence, perhaps automatically, unconsciously, you're doing this. And without realizing it, you are, as a fluent reader, setting different standards of coherence for different texts. It might be the case that if you're reading, a trashy crime novel in bed late at night, you might be letting certain stuff go in a way that you're not when you're reading an academic paper where you really want to grasp everything.
So I think that's a pretty clear, sort of quick journey through what reading comprehension is. But what different aspects of comprehension are there, and to what extent are they discrete?
Thinking about what I said a moment ago, it's worth noting that any definition really of reading comprehension isn't complete until we think about some or all of the aspects that contribute to it. So I talked about decoding, and I'm going to leave that for the rest of today because that's several podcasts on its own. But within that other side, that language comprehension that contributes to reading comprehension, there are different aspects that interact. So there are things like vocabulary. There is the depth and breadth of your vocabulary that is implicated in different aspects of reading comprehension. There is background knowledge, which is effectively the knowledge of the world that you bring to a given text. There is also certain strategies, like we've already discussed, the idea of comprehension monitoring and setting a standard for coherence. There's your knowledge of texts, or in particular text structures. There's knowledge of syntax and how particular sentence structures work. And there are other bits and pieces, but that gives you a flavor of the key parts. What's really interesting here is that the most common metaphor that I see used, and understandably so, because it's a brilliant visual metaphor, to describe reading comprehension is of a rope, the idea of all of these different aspects being like the strands that intertwine to go together to make a rope. And I'm not disagreeing with that. I think it is a great visual metaphor. Something that I perhaps add to that is that the more I read about comprehension and the more that I teach it and the more that I learn about it, I think an additional metaphor is the idea of notes in a chord, in a sense that we can't, if I were to say, you know, I play A minor or whatever it might be, if I said, oh, you can hear the 4 notes that I'm playing on the piano as I do that, it wouldn't really make sense for me to say, oh, okay, which of those 4 is the A minor? Which one's doing the job of creating A minor, or in this case, creating reading comprehension? It's like, well, actually, it's the interaction between them. They are different based on how they interact with the other ones. So, for example, if I give you a very basic sentence, if I give you a sentence like, Jacob looked at his CV and grimaced, it was hopeless. Now, there's a lot going on in that sentence in order to comprehend it. But the thing I want to point out in particular is the fact that what the word it means here, because it would be dead easy to think that it is referring to his CV, when in fact, it's actually relating to the situation on the whole. Well, how do we know it's relating to the situation on the whole? Well, firstly, it's something to do with the brevity of that sentence. It's just saying it was hopeless, just kind of suggests that we're talking about a situation rather than a specific concrete thing. The fact that he grimaced suggests that something's wrong. And so then when we say that something's hopeless, we're more likely to be talking about the situation as a whole. In short, the vocabulary, our understanding of the syntax, it all kind of begins to fit together to give us this sense that probably, though not certainly, the author is talking about the situation here rather than the CV itself. And there are lots of circumstances, and I'll talk about a few more of these later, where our background knowledge changes what we're thinking about. Another great example of this would be in a sentence where I was talking about falcons. Well, the rest of that sentence and the background knowledge that I described there is going to let me know whether I'm talking about the bird of prey or whether I'm talking about I think it's Newcastle rugby team. You know, it's so how you, and this is all happening quickly and in the moment, but in each case, one is feeding into the other. The other part of your question was, well, okay, to what extent are these discrete? And this is also where I go back to my kind of piano chords analogy, in that really we can only see them as a whole thing, in that there's so much overlap between them. So for example, if I were to say, tell me about your vocabulary depth relating to the word oak, you know, and you might talk about you know, English forests and all sorts of things relating to nature, and you might talk about the idea of something being sturdy and metaphors to do with something being robust, yada, yada, yada. Now, if I were to say, okay, now what is your background knowledge relating to oak trees? Well, where does one begin and one end? And yet we do often talk about, well, these two different things, you know, our vocabulary, but also our background knowledge. And there are certain circumstances when we're reading when it's really clear that, oh yeah, this is definitely their vocabulary and this is definitely background knowledge, because we haven't even used any words to describe precisely this thing. We just know it needs to come in because of some inference we've made. But actually, in a lot of cases, is it vocabulary we're talking about? Is it background knowledge? I saw this lovely, I think it was in the book, Words in the Mind by Jean Aitchison. There's this picture of a town where you can see that they're almost like tunnels underneath where it all links together. And it shows that actually, almost at the roots of what's going on, vocabulary and background knowledge are sort of one and the same, and drawing a line, an arbitrary line between them is just, it's convenient, but it's not necessarily the greatest representation of what's really going on. So in short, the aspects of reading comprehension are things like vocabulary, background knowledge, knowledge of text structure, comprehension strategies that we learn quickly and then apply to different texts. And it's also important to know that these aspects they interact, but also they kind of blur at the edges as well.
It brings into question some of the text choices for SATs papers I've experienced in the past. The one that comes to mind immediately is it was the old SATs papers, cave diving, spelunking, something along those lines. And I hadn't even been spelunking at that point, never mind the kids in my class. I was like, what is this? And then years later to find out that that background knowledge had such an important role to play. I was like, oh my goodness.
Yeah, I remember someone mentioning online that their school had beekeepers into school a week or a couple of weeks before the SATs, and then up came questions on bees, and their kids just absolutely went to town on that SATs paper, scored brilliantly. You're absolutely right. It calls into question the validity of assessments relating to reading comprehension. I'm of the opinion, I'd almost go as far as to say that if you know the extent to which a child is a fluent reader from hearing them read, and you have a good idea of the extent to which they have knowledge of the world and how familiar they are with particular text structures, they're fairly happy working their way around a narrative or an information text. They know the differences between the two, what to expect from the two. That I would see that as a more valid assessment of reading as a thing, or reading comprehension as a thing, than comprehension tests, which are so dependent on the knowledge, as it were, that is contained within that test.
Before the sort of the January, February lockdown, I decided to take my Spanish to the next level and do, the DELI, which is almost like your Central European framework. And I thought, right, okay, I'm going to spend a year. I'm going to get to C2. I'm going to really nail this language. And the first thing that the tutor did was give me a Spanish paper that they thought was going to be difficult on cognitive psychology. And obviously there are there are lots of, like it's not difficult to work out what cognitiva means, and having reasonable background knowledge in the, they were all like, wow, this is amazing. And then the next paper was on those little grub insects that sort of eat at your furniture and stuff. And it was a totally different story, and it was night and day, thinking, I know a lot about this and I can use that to my advantage. I don't know anything about this. I'm in big trouble. I'm going to work twice as hard to get through this lesson. And in your book, you mentioned the situation model. What is, for anyone listening who's not sure, what is the situation model and why is it worth knowing about?
I'd say the best analogy I can give to demonstrate what a situation model is to talk through a little bit of my teaching career, or a particular experience from my teaching career. About 4 years ago, I turned up at an assembly to find that it was an NQT's turn to do an assembly. Not that that's necessarily ideal, but that's what it was. And they'd completely forgotten. And they had this look in their eyes that said, I can't improvise an assembly, and who could in their first year of teaching. So I'd love to say that I boldly and nobly stepped up, but there was no one else there. So that was literally the only reason why I was like, okay, it's got to be me. I've been working with a group of kids for a couple of years, or two different groups of kids, I should say, of roughly a similar level. I'd read the Iron Man to each class, so it was kind of familiar to me. And I thought, you know what? If I've got to do an assembly off the cuff and I've got 20 minutes, I reckon I could do a half decent rendition of the Iron Man. And I still think I could. I reckon I could do a 15-20 minute version of the Iron Man right now. Now, the interesting point is that if you said to me, okay, tell me a single whole sentence from that book, or even name specifically, I think the space angel bat dragon thing that comes towards the end, I wouldn't be able to. I can't. I haven't got in my memory a particular sentence at all. That said, what I do have is a situation model or what is described in the research literature as a situation model. In that, I have, for want of a better phrase, constructed, put together the gist of the story, including characters, certain situations, the basics of the plot, each of these being integrated. I mean, I'd say one of the best ways to think about situation models, and again, this is another analogy, this is not what goes on, just a metaphor, so don't tweet me about this because this is just my idea. But my way of thinking about it is, if you imagine a spider diagram or your mind map, whatever you want to call it, with the words at the center and then the little branches that come off, and then other words, and then other things come off that. Imagine one of those for a character, and another one of those for the plot, and another one of those for the different settings that come up. But instead of these being discrete entities, over time, as you read the story, you build up these spider diagrams and they begin to interact. And crucially, over time, a bit like the way that we forget phone numbers that we no longer need, we kind of remove parts of it, you know. So if you were to ask me the plot of The Great Gatsby, same as with the Iron Man, I'd be able to give you, talk through the plot to an extent, but I probably couldn't name any particular sentences from it. And it's the same thing, because I've got this overall structure that I've put together. But crucially, as I was reading the story of The Great Gatsby, there will have been bits in there that I read at the time and thought were clever, thought were funny, liked, thought were relevant, and then over time realized that they weren't relevant, or they weren't essential to my understanding. And this is what a situation model is all about. It is the construction of key ideas by bringing in bits of information from the text. But crucially, it's almost that it's like we prune that as well. We integrate it and we prune it. So we integrate these different bits to help out with our understanding. So we end up with this one integrated situation model. But we also prune the bits that we seem to prune the bits that we don't need, those things that aren't obviously essential to the story. Now, in both cases, I've talked about narratives here, but obviously the same thing is true of information texts or biographies or whatever text type you would hope to deal with. So just very quickly, when I've had discussions about situation models online and people have said, well, why do we need the phrase situation model? Why do we just not say it's comprehension? I think that it's a useful idea for two key reasons. The first is that it implies something active. It suggests that you are actively building something, which at the very least is a valuable metaphor for children when they are learning to read. The idea that this reading isn't, while eventually it will feel unconscious what we're doing and it will just kind of happen, particularly with trickier texts, we really do need to feel like, oh, that's an interesting bit of information that changes what I thought about this. And it kind of, it's an active process of almost like you're building something. And the second reason I think it's an important idea is this pruning idea, or I guess a better way to put it would be something like streamlining. The idea that over time your model gets more efficient, and the bits that you require are all for understanding are all that remain. And I think when you talk about comprehension without this idea of a situation model, you don't end up necessarily with the idea of it being active and the idea of it being something that you streamline as. I don't think that it comes out that that's definitely part of the process.
Yeah, I really like that model too. I've got two almost parts of a follow-up. So when I look at an academic paper and I recognize the font, I recognize the front page because they're normally quite distinct, and I have a sense of what this is about. I suppose the first bit is that my situation model in play? And the second part is, if I've misunderstood the first time and I prune the wrong stuff, can my situation model have an inaccurate interpretation of what I've read?
Oh yeah, I mean, a situation model, there is no implication of accuracy behind it. I mean, I think it's absolutely possible to have a completely inaccurate situation model. So for example, a child who had recently seen the film Iron Man might come to the book The Iron Man with a very different set of ideas. So when at the start of the story, the Iron Man falls off the cliff and crashes into bits, a kid might be going, well, this doesn't make any sense. Why is he not just flying? Because I know he can in his suit. So it can immediately become quite confusing. It's totally possible for a situation model to be wrong. I think the first thing you asked there is really interesting. It's something I'd never really considered, which is the idea, when we think of situation models, I'm always thinking about the things that you bring to the text that are textual, that are purely related to or verbal only. And yet I know for a fact, thinking back to The Iron Man or The Great Gatsby, as soon as I think about that text, part of me is also thinking about the front cover that I'm most familiar with. It's thinking about certain images, particularly in the Iron Man. And funnily enough, I actually think of two particular front covers, and each of them has a different feel for me. There's this older one with a black front cover where it's just the Iron Man's metallic face. And I read that one, or had that one read to me as a kid. And that one is quite when I think of that one, I imagine the Iron Man as this intimidating, dark story, because it felt that way to me as a child. And yet when I think of another front cover, there's a white front cover, quite stylized, the one that I've always used when reading to children. I've got a slightly different impression of it. So I think, the idea of a situation model this is completely speculative, but I don't have any, I would suggest that there's no reason why it shouldn't have components attached to it that aren't purely related to the words as such, and that could go kind of a bit beyond that in order to give you a slightly different interpretation. In fact, I'd be stunned if our emotions relating to a text, our perception of the aesthetics relating to a given text weren't in some way linked in and triggered when we think about the text itself.
That's really interesting. Not necessarily all good news though, because whenever I write academic assignments, I will try and use that situation model at the very end. I'll look at it and go, okay, that's what I remember. That's what I remember. But if I'm remembering the wrong stuff, and I don't necessarily have time to check, this could be bad news. No, I'm joking. So I think a lot of time in schools is dedicated to comprehension skills or strategies. What's the difference between comprehension skills and comprehension strategies? Because I think that's important to know if we're going to dedicate so much time to them.
Yeah, I'll come back to the idea of the amount of time that should perhaps be dedicated to them. There is a very important difference between skills and strategies, at least in the academic literature that I've seen on the two of them. They're very commonly written about. Comprehension skills, or just skills generally, are usually talked about as facilities that can be developed, or faculties, I should say, that can be developed over time, almost on a spectrum, so that over the space of weeks or months or years, you can get stronger and stronger and stronger at them. And it's worth devoting that time to them in order to slowly but surely, incrementally get much stronger at them. A strategy, in at least this context, is something slightly different. It's a bit like the comprehension monitoring that I mentioned earlier, the idea of keeping track of whether it's making sense, whether a text is making sense, and knowing that it's a good idea to go back and read again if it doesn't. That's a strategy. That's not something that builds up incrementally over time necessarily, or if it does, it's pretty rapid. It's more of a trick. It's an idea, it's something that you need to make children aware of, rather than that you need to make them aware of it and model it and develop the habit of it, I would say. And so there is still an element of time involved, but it's more about habit formation more than it is about this incremental building up of a particular faculty. Now, which one should we teach? Well, those of the audience who have listened to my previous podcast with you on the subject of reading a few weeks back, gluttons for punishment, though they must be, they'll know that I don't necessarily consider comprehension skills to be a thing, or if they are a thing, they're not, they can't be developed in the way that we would usually consider a skill to be developed. So I talked previously about the idea of inference, the idea that, inference is a discrete thing doesn't make any sense to me, because there are certain sentences, you were talking about learning about cognitive psychology in a different language. There are certain sentences that you can make all of the inferences you need to because you have the background knowledge, because you know the words in question, etc. And then there are sentences that you have no chance with. And then there are people who would be vice versa, who wouldn't know anything about cognitive psychology and wouldn't make the appropriate inferences, but would make appropriate inferences in another situation, suggesting that inference itself isn't this generic skill. It is, and this is my favorite phrase relating to a lot of these supposed comprehension skills, is that inference is much more like an emergent property. It is what occurs through the interaction of your understanding of words, texts, the wider world, and of course your ability to kind of read through the text relatively fluently, so that you don't have to think about the decoding and you've got kind of the cognitive space to deal with it. So in short, things like predicting, summarizing, these are not discrete skills to be built up over time. Some of them are worthwhile strategies. So it can be sensible to say to children, if you get to the end of a paragraph, it's worth maybe summarizing in your head what that paragraph was about. And once children have developed that habit, they've got it. It's theirs. That's all they really need to have in order to be able to do that, as long as they've got the requisite vocabulary and background knowledge and this sort of thing. So should we dedicate time to having a lesson on inference and a lesson on vocabulary, as if every reading lesson isn't a lesson on vocabulary? Of course it is. Should we have a lesson on inference on Monday and lesson on vocabulary on Tuesday? And should we do retrieval on a Wednesday, as if retrieval is a skill rather than just something you can do when you have the requisite background knowledge, understanding of text structure, vocabulary, syntax required to understand a given sentence? So yeah, we shouldn't, there's no point teaching those skills. It is worthwhile spending a little time developing habits. And in fact, I would say a lot of that habit development, things are like, if you get to the end of a paragraph, summarize it. If you think it's at the end of a chapter, it's worth having a sentence summary in your head, particularly in a non-fiction text. Particularly in a non-fiction text, it might be worth having summarizing. It's just as a habit. These are little things that you can teach in the moment through modeling. It doesn't have to be a specific set of lessons. Now, it's worth noting that there is a large literature on the teaching of comprehension strategies. So I wouldn't want to put any teachers off the idea of saying, oh, actually, I'm going to teach them explicitly. We're going to have a lesson every month where, so that by the end of the year, we've got 4 or 5 weeks, by the end of their education, we've got 4 or 5 weeks of explicitly teaching these comprehension strategies. I don't think that's a bad idea necessarily. Just in my experience, I think that these strategies like rereading when you're not sure, summarizing at the end of a paragraph, this sort of thing, these kind of bits of metacognition effectively for reading are things that you can just model in the process of reading. Beyond that, what should our teaching of comprehension look like? It doesn't need to be this attempt to teach discrete skills. It can just be the interaction with lots and lots of rich text with worthwhile discussion and questioning.
I mean, it's really interesting you say that, because there are lots of products out there based around the model that you were sort of saying we should try and avoid when we're teaching reading. How do you think, how is it possible that we've gotten to that position? Because I remember when we last spoke about reading, you were talking about how there was a general consensus about the way we learn to read, particularly, early on. So is it a case that the market has chosen to go in a different direction because it's slightly more marketable direction, or is it just a case of the field being considerably more advanced than our understanding of it? I don't know. How have we gotten to that point?
I think it's both. I don't think that most teachers that I have come across have had a particularly, and I count myself in that, have had a particularly good grounding on the research that does exist on the subject of reading in terms of their initial teacher training. And to an extent, I don't think that's necessarily purely the fault of initial teacher trainers. I think there's a lot to get in on a PGCE. Really, I think it comes down to schools prioritizing that their teachers then learn this stuff. Maybe it's the case. I couldn't speak for what happens in initial teacher training because I've only experienced my own, but I can speak to an extent to what happens in schools from conversations with lots and lots and lots of people about their early career. There doesn't seem to be that much of a focus of supporting teachers to get the basics of reading research. Now, it's worth noting, just to make a little point here, I applied to speak at something recently without naming names, and the title I was intended to go for was what every teacher needed to know about reading, and it was a 45-minute or so talk, or would be. And obviously it's a bit tongue-in-cheek because no teacher is going to get everything they need to know in 45 minutes. I absolutely do think that in 45 minutes, you could get across more of the crucial bits and pieces with a suitable level of nuance than most teachers already have. That's the crucial thing. It isn't that you can teach them everything, but you can certainly make strides in the right direction in 45 minutes, which I think tells its own story. Going back to your point about specific products and where this comes from, it's the same old story of schools looking for simple solutions to complex problems. And most importantly, it comes down to people wanting something that's nice and easy to explain to their teachers, but also fits in with what they think is already the case relating to SATs. You are pushing on open door with most senior leaders that I've met. If you say the way to boost reading outcomes is to do this thing that aligns with the particular kinds of questions that children are going to see in the SATs, that's really what it boils down to. I think there's also an element in which, again, your mileage may vary, but a lot of the reading coordinators that I've come across have happened to work in Key Stage 2 rather than Key Stage 1 or in reception. And again, I think there's a tendency, if you're in Key Stage 2, to be looking upwards towards Year 6 and thinking, SATs, let's do something that looks like the SATs. And effectively, most of the products that are out there, or many of the most popular products, retrofit the way to teach reading, and specifically reading comprehension, from the types of questions that exist in the SATs test. And it's not great, really. If I can use another silly analogy, it's a bit like noticing that marathon runners are all, like, the really successful marathon runners are the ones that are first to run through the finishing line tape. And so you, as a marathon runner, you think, well, I need to practice running through tape. It's a bit like that.
Yeah, no, it's amazing because you mentioned a paper earlier on from 1986, which means that paper is as old as me, and yeah, and the fact that, you know, when I saw your book, you know, months ago now, and I thought this is going to be a fantastic read, you know, for many reasons, but because it's going to make everything that's really important about reading instruction really, really clear, you know. And I'm pretty sure you've gone to great lengths to be really lean as well. So you've only included, the information that is absolutely necessary and the exemplification that will best help leaders, teachers out. I really wish, I'm not trying to push your book or anything because I think it sells itself. But I could have done with that, 15 years ago. And I like the like the marathon runner analogy. I've actually got a new analogy that we can work on towards the end of the show. But that makes a lot of sense. And I can see exactly how we can end up in that situation. And I think, not entirely sure when this episode will go out, but I'm really looking forward to that talk you're going to do. If you do it, I assume that you will be doing it on the 4th of September.
Oh, well, we'll see. We'll see. Just to note as well, because anyone who knows the reading research, who says, hang on a minute, he's made everything really clear, alarm bells will be going off, because anyone who says this is the way to teach reading and it will work in all circumstances is someone who's read just enough of the research to get themselves into trouble. However, I do think that there are certain underlying principles that are good bets from what we can see from the current mountain of reading research that allow us to make informed decisions.
So I think, rounding it off, Chris, in practical terms, what immediately applicable advice would you give to teachers to support their students' development? And I'm thinking about myself, if in the future I'm back in the classroom and teaching reading after a 10-year hiatus, what advice are you going to give me?
Now, I had two options with this. I thought, I can narrow it down to just a couple of key things, like a really thoughtful podcast participant would do, or I could indulge and reel off the long list of them. And I'm going with the second because you know the way I am. So I'm gonna read a load, and the ones that sound most pertinent to you, dear listener, take those. So practical things that have worked for me. So that's the caveat, things that I found work for me. The first thing is knowing that fluency is necessary. Checking phonics and fluency using good assessments. In the case of fluency, that's likely to be a Dybel's assessment or something similar to that can be found free online. When it comes to phonics, it's likely to be the assessment that relates to your phonics program, though there are good ones out there. The second thing we've already mentioned, less teaching of skills, more encountering and discussing worthwhile texts, less answering questions in writing as well. I wouldn't say get rid of writing in your reading lessons entirely. This can be a valuable way to understand thinking, can be a valuable assessment opportunity, but it shouldn't be taking up a significant chunk of your time. Most of your reading lessons should be about reading. Reading things and discussing texts should make up most of your reading time, however you organize your reading lessons. I found it really useful, having read a bit about a technique called questioning the author by McCowan, from Beck, McCowan and Kuchen fame. She talks about priming children to know that they need to make sense of what's going on and that there's a responsibility on them to make sense by centering the author in your questions. So instead of saying, what does this metaphor mean? Saying a simple change like, what did the author want to express with this metaphor? Showing that there's a bit of ambiguity in there, but also showing that, the job's on you and the author may not have communicated this absolutely perfectly and you're going to have to bridge that divide. I'd say this one is one that I picked up a bit from Reading Reconsidered, Doug Lemov's book on the subject, which is aimed mainly at, I would say, upper key stage 2 secondary school, but I think it does have value, which is to think about questions on the word, sentence, and paragraph level as one of the ways of just making sure that you are asking a variety of questions. Something to just get you started is this idea of make sure you're thinking about questions and thinking about discussion on the word level, the sentence level, the paragraph level, and actually beyond that on the whole text level where appropriate. And also think about questions that establish meaning, and those that analyze meaning, those that say, okay, what is this? What is the author trying to say here? And those that say, well, why do you think the author chose this? What would have happened if he chose, or if she had chosen this instead? So yeah, things that look at humor and authorial intent. Pick texts carefully. Not enough schools, in my experience, do this. You're looking for texts that do have a certain amount of variety, but you're looking for a certain quality of text that allow for the opportunities for discussion that you're after. Yes, maybe you're teaching children about instructions and you want to read a recipe with them. Fine, they're going to learn something about the structure of that text, but it isn't great if you're looking to unpick other aspects of reading relating to authorial intent and metaphor and this sort of thing. I would also say in your reading lessons, take advantage of partner talk. Again, personal experience here. I'm not basing this on any particular reading research necessarily. This is just something I found works quite well in my reading lessons when I've done it, which is if I am going to ask children a question, giving them the chance to rehearse an answer, effectively use think, pair, share, is a great way to encourage discussion. You can go to children and say, what were you two talking about, rather than putting children like individually on the spot. I would say also, don't be afraid to explain things. Don't be afraid to just say, this word means this. In my experience, the best reading lessons I've seen, for every occasion where a teacher has said, what do you think this phrase might mean? There's been at least 2 or 3 where they've said, this word means this. Here's a picture that shows you what this word means. It helps keep the pace of a lesson, and often it's just the best way to get an idea across. Last couple, teach vocabulary when you encounter it. It's okay to introduce vocabulary before. Again, in my experience, children remember it a bit better if you wait until it arrives in a text and then you go, oh, this word that was in this sentence, it also means this, and you give it to them in child-friendly language. As with any other area of learning, model your thinking. If you get to the end of a paragraph and you think, ooh, that's going to be tough going for them, that is a rough paragraph, even if you've understood it perfectly, don't be afraid to just kind of model your thinking or your pretend thinking by saying, that was a tricky paragraph. Let's read that again and see if there's any parts that we really struggled with. Just modeling this idea of setting a standard for coherence or comprehension monitoring is really valuable. Last couple of tips would really be about things that you can check out in order to take your understanding of reading comprehension a bit further. Kieran's already plugged my book on my behalf, so I won't add any more on that. I would check out the blogs of James Durran online. He's got some really interesting blogs. There's a couple that talk about a sequence that he goes through in teaching an English lesson relating to reading. I read that and thought, wow, that is a really impressive sequence of teaching reading. It's worth checking out the book Understanding and Teaching Reading Comprehension by Oak Hill, Kane and Eldrow. Once you've read that, look into comprehension strategies and the limitations of them, because I think they take a particular view on reading comprehension, but it's still an excellent book to check out. Subscribe to Timothy Shanahan's blog. He says really interesting things about reading all the time. And also potentially, particularly if you work in upper key stage 2, or maybe even secondary schools, if you're tuning in, I would consider Doug Lemov's Reading Reconsidered. I know it's Doug Lemov and a couple of other authors. I apologize to the other authors, because right now off the top of my head, I can only remember that Doug Lemov is one of the authors. So yeah, check that out.
Excellent. Lots of great advice there that I think will be really useful, whatever stage of career that people might be in. So on that note, all that's left to say is thank you very much, Chris.
Thanks for having me on again.
And thank you very much to everyone for listening. We'll see you next time.